Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the Roundtable meeting, and welcome back to those of you who were able to join us yesterday. If you weren't with us yesterday, we've got a really, you missed a couple of great presentations, one from Robin Ely from Harvard Business School, talking about work-family supports and gender inequality, and the other from a really great panel, I thought, of folks talking about, in conversation with Jennifer, about LGBTQ employees and parents and how workplaces can support them. And it was really impressive to see, especially what EY was doing with supports for LGBTQ individuals. So today we've got also a very, very good agenda. And if we go to the next slide, Jen, oh, that's me. We can go back to that.
Let's pause there for a moment.
Oh, I see. Okay, if people want to dwell on this slide for a moment, feel free. But otherwise, we'll move along since they can see me in reality. There it is. So this morning we're really pleased to have our keynote speaker Rohini Anand first thing, and then what we're going to do is after Rohini wraps up, we're going to ask you to spend a little bit of time both individually and in groups reflecting on some of the great points that Rohini makes about being kind of a change agent in the D&I space, and to do that first individually and then in small groups. After that, we will have a speaker from State Street who's leading their Workplace of the Future efforts, and she's got a really, I think, interesting take on how State Street is kind of reimagining the workplace going forward. We'll take a lunch break, and then after lunch, we'll go to the open forums, which is something that you guys have always found kind of very popular. We're going to break into three groups, I believe, and it will be one will be focused on mental health, one on new working models, and the third will be on customizing the employee experience. And I think, you know, Jennifer or I will describe what that's all about, but this is where you really get to learn from one another as opposed to just having great speakers. It's really valuable for people to learn from their colleagues who are tackling similar issues within their own organization. Then there'll be a member spotlight on Northrop Grumman, where they're going to talk about the comprehensive well-being program. And then our last speaker will be Professor Leslie Hammer from Portland State University, talking about how the empathy that managers convey can really support the well-being of their people. Leslie is, you know, without a doubt, one of the most cited researchers in this space, and she's done a lot of collaborative work looking at, you know, how managers can create a more an environment that really promotes health and well-being. And then we'll do a brief closing circle at the end. So with that, what I'd like to do is move to our keynote speaker this morning, Rohini Anand. Rohini is somebody that we've gotten to know very, very well over the years. Sodexo was a very involved member of the Center for Work and Family for quite a long time. And Rohini was somebody who always offered good contributions, whether that be in one-to-one conversations with her or on the occasions she's had the opportunity to present to the roundtable. Rohini, now is an author. Okay, she used to be a corporate person, but now she's in recovery from her corporate life and is an author. But she's still a real thought leader in this space, and she's very active in the consulting arena as well on this issue. And her reputation in the D&I space is such that I think a lot of people would want to seek out her advice and guidance. She also is a board member for a lot of interesting organizations that are doing good work to promote diversity, inclusion, and belonging. For those of you who hadn't met her before, Rohini was the global leader of D&I and corporate social responsibility for Sodexo for, I believe, the last 16 years of her corporate career. And during that time, she won more awards than I could list. I didn't have room on the slide to include all the recognition she's gotten for the great work she did. But I think probably the best measure of her contributions to the field is the fact that her employer, Sodexo, which is a very, very large, very global company with literally thousands of work sites, I believe, Rohini, around the world, was for 11 consecutive years, they were listed in Diversity Inc.'s top 10 organizations for promoting D&I. And so I think the impact she had on the organization speaks louder than probably anything else. And I think in the initial year where Diversity Inc. decided to have a Hall of Fame, I think Sodexo was one of the charter members of the group that was selected. So with that, I would like to say welcome, Rohini. And the way we're going to do this is, believe it or not, no PowerPoint slides other than that one. And we're going to really just have a conversation. I don't know how many folks ended up registering in time to get a book. Jennifer, was there?
Yeah, we had about 35 people who either have a book in hand or it's on their way to its way to them. Yes.
There won't be a quiz on the book, but we will be talking a lot about the book today and the great thoughts that are in that book. I read it in the past week, and it was a wonderful book. A lot of times I get to one of these corporate books, I get through chapter 1 or 2, and I'm like, okay, I sort of get it. But this time I literally read it cover to cover, and it was just a terrific book. Before we start talking about that, though, Rohini, I'd just like to say welcome and obviously just ask you a little bit about you personally. What brought you to this journey and this, I'll say calling that you seem to have had to get into the D&I space? What moved you there over the course of your life or your career that you could just share with the folks?
Yeah, thanks, Brad, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. And I have to say my apologies for those of you that maybe have been brave enough to dial in from the West Coast. I was supposed to be on later, but I've changed the timing so many times, and thanks to Jennifer for her flexibility. I'm getting on a flight in 2 hours to go to Asia. So I wanted to squeeze this in before I did that. But yeah, I think that we've had a long relationship, Brad, and I've always valued your thought leadership as well. So thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, so what brought me to this work? I think for all those of you that are involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, you know that it's very personal. And it's very personal for me, for sure. And my story is sort of integral to who I am. I grew up in Mumbai, and actually I'm going to Mumbai tonight to be with my mom. And growing up in Mumbai, almost everyone looked like me. I belonged to the majority religion, Hinduism, and surrounded by others like me, I had the privilege of not having to think about my identity. So it was my move to the US as a single woman immigrant, which was really an inflection point, both literally and metaphorically in my journey. And my identity shifted from being a person who saw herself at the center of her world to being a minority, to being an immigrant, to being a foreigner. And honestly, I was completely unprepared for that. And it was only when I was identified as a minority that I realized the privileges that came with being part of a majority. I was part of a majority growing up in India, and I hadn't recognized my privilege in that way. In fact, I was unable to until I was perceived as a minority and I experienced things differently. So this realization that identity is situational, that it's fluid, has informed my research and still informs my work. And my vocation is very personal to me. I say that my vocation and avocation are perfectly aligned, because understanding what it means to be perceived as an outsider is really at the heart of DEI work. And my work is about leveling the playing field so everyone can succeed. So that's a little bit about sort of what brought me to the work that I do today.
Okay. And as your career as a very, very well-respected corporate D&I leader was coming to a close, there's 2 ways I guess I could ask this question. What possessed you to write a book, or what in the world possessed you to write a book? Because I know, having done one, what an undertaking that is. So I don't know, at what point did you get the inspiration to do this? Rohini, were you working on it during your last years at Sodexo, or is it something you decided that was what you wanted to do when you wrapped up your corporate work with?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I wasn't working on it my last year at Sodexo. There's no way I could have done my job and worked on a book. But I rewired from Sodexo in January of 2020 and COVID hit. So I just decided to hunker down and to write about my lived experiences. I mean, we were all home. It was a new experience. We hadn't quite figured out how to make this stuff work. And for me, it really was an act of giving back. What I had acquired from doing this work for so many years, and really sharing some of my insights with those of you who do the difficult work of DEI culture change. So it was, in a sense, an act of reflection. It was an act of closure. It was an act of giving back. But honestly, I was also prompted by the fact that progress in this work has been so painfully slow. CEOs have made sort of performative statements. After the murder of George Floyd, they gave $200 billion and more. Chief diversity officers were hired, etc. But no real progress was made. And I just saw this as a moment to be more ambitious, to unfreeze the way things had been done. It was an opportunity, it was a window. But the question was, how do you go from sort of these situational actions to really sustainable progress, particularly globally? And in doing this work, I had yearned for a book, sort of a practical book, not an academic book, because global diversity really generated the most interest and honestly the most frustration. So this is not an academic book. It's not a theoretical book. It's, practical book, a view from the trenches, and, someone who sort of have to figure it out without any real map. And I wish I'd had some sort of a map. So that's sort of what the impetus was for this book.
Yeah, when I was in the corporate world working for HP, I was in the change agent role, and that was really around quality and quality improvement at that time, working for the president of our company and trying to move that agenda along. And one of the things that struck me was, the things I did as a change agent and the things you described in the book were one for one in terms of the topics were different, but the methodology and the way to gain traction within an organization, maintain momentum and things like that, and measure progress, all of those things were very, very similar. When you set out to write this book, did you think the people I know it was the D&I change agents, but did you really think that was the primary focus, was how do I get the change agents to understand the challenge and understand the methodologies they can use to address these challenges? Were they the folks you were thinking about?
Yeah, I think so, Brad. I mean, I think I was thinking about them, and I was thinking about leaders. I mean, this is more of a leadership book. So it really was more about leaders in terms of how they can, sort of amplify their impact. And, to be honest, initially it was sort of more of a combination. When I started off, it was more, in my head, it was more of a, how do you do this work, right? And as I started writing, I realized that what was more important is the sort of informative story behind the story.
Yeah.
And so, the book has, I think, two sort of meta stories. One is an honest recounting of the missteps and the lessons that I learned, because honestly, it's those challenges that really brought me the greatest inspiration, the greatest insight, and ultimately, brought the most lasting change. So one example, and I think you recall this, that I start off with in the book, is the story of, about India. Now, I grew up in India. I thought I understood the culture. And certainly it was very familiar. I would go to India several times a year, went to India to do DI work for Sodexo. And I was sitting in a room with entry to mid-level women managers and talking to them about how the company could help them to advance their careers. And in this conversation, I started talking about leadership development and mentoring, and was met with these blank stares. And so I sort of realized that I was just not connecting. I, tried a few words of Hindi, but just, something was not resonating for them. So then I asked them, I said, what can the company do to help you to advance your careers? And after a minute of silence, one of the women raised her hand and said, we live in these joint families, multi-generational families. And, we can't stay late at work to work on special projects or do any development work, because we have to go home, we have to take care of the house, we have to cook the dinner, we have to take care of our in-laws because we live with our in-laws. And once that started, every one of those women had a story to share. And I had, just was quite an aha moment for me, because I had forgotten, this multi-generational joint family dynamic. And I honestly forgotten the role of the Indian woman, not just as a mother and a wife, but also as a daughter-in-law. Mm-hmm. And in that, I'd forgotten my own limitations as this sort of multi-dimensional being, and clearly focused on just one aspect of our shared identity with these women, overlooking the many differences. So I stepped back and I said, I was perplexed. I said, so what can the company do in this situation? Because clearly, I was confused. I mean, what is it that we can do? So they came up with a solution. And the solution was that let's do a recognition day where, we showcase our projects, we invite our extended families. So we did this, we gave them awards, we made a big fuss over it, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful event. And the families were so pleased. So now, did it change the dynamic at home that they could stay late and work on projects, or, they were given some space, not having to do all the housework and cook dinners. Maybe, a little bit that, the mother-in-law would cook the meal in the evening rather than wait for the daughter-in-law to come home after having worked all day. But clearly for me, this misstep taught me one of those early lessons, which was it's not useful to export initiatives that have worked in one part of the world on another part of the world. And clearly I have to check my sort of presumptions. So that sort of meta story, as well as a meta story of my own journey, how I changed. I mean, I'm a work in progress. So I share sort of a candid window into my own journey and my own growth in the DI. So.
Yeah. I also think the part of your story, which is great, is just the listening piece. So often when you're in a corporate role and, we have a tendency to say, oh, we're going to visit these other countries. And so our job is to show up with our PowerPoint or our Google Slides and tell them, what we're about. And there are so few times when corporate people show up and really say, I'm here to listen to you and understand your world and your experience. And when you do that, it's just such a revelation to understand why it's so difficult to export US, practices and assume they're going to work in different cultures and different legal environments, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to just say is I love the opening of your book. You say every country has its legacy of hurt. And I learned that one of my most important tasks was uncovering and seeking to understand those legacies. Could you just say, a little bit more about that opening quote?
Yeah, so I think, every part of the world clearly has its dominant and subordinate groups. Every part of the world has insiders and outsiders, right? And identity is expressed in different ways. And it doesn't always show up as issues of race. And I think if we take this sort of one lens to, different parts of the world, I think sometimes we miss some of the dynamics because, this dominant and subordinate groups are often entangled with ethnicity, with religion, with caste, which may take a more prominent role than race. Mm-hmm. In the US, race has been this driving social force. But, in other parts of the world, for instance, race is one of several identities that divide and play a less prominent role. So I think this legacy of hurt exists. I think it's unpacking it. It's really about, understanding who the dominant and subordinate groups are, who the outsiders are. And then with that understanding, working to disrupt the status quo. So it's not about just accepting things that, the status quo and the power dynamics. It is about working to disrupt it, but with an understanding and in partnership with local change agents.
Yeah, very good. You mentioned early on in the book, right in the opening chapter, I think, that you had sort of 5 guiding principles that you thought would be helpful to practitioners. Could you just share those so people get a sense of what these guiding principles are?
Sure. And I have 2 chapters, Brad, as you know, on each of those guiding principles. So essentially what I found was that given this sort of complex and dynamic nature of the work, there's really no quick checklist, or there's no playbook or best practices that can inform the work. But each time I found, as you said, yourself in doing change work, these 5 key elements that drove success. And they, I sort of see them as principles that provide a through line. And each principle is a very simple statement that includes my experiences, but experiences of others as well. They're simple, but they're very disruptive. And they're not intended to provide standards or plug and play templates based on what's worked in the US. And to me, as I said before, that's one of the foundational mistakes, is to replicate what's worked in one part of the world. But these principles can be applied with sensitivity to any culture. And what it does is it empowers leaders to develop their own solutions and not to mimic any one leader or one part of the world's experience. Mm-hmm. So the principles are, first is make it local. And I think this is absolutely critical to the work, that global DEI change has to be anchored in an understanding of the local context. It has to be rooted in the local particulars, informed by the history, the culture, the language, and the laws. And you have to consider how identity is defined and expressed. And as I mentioned, this sort of power structures, the dominant subordinate groups. So understanding the context is the first step in finding strategies to really advance underrepresented groups locally. But it doesn't mean accepting the status quo. In fact, outside influence can be a catalyst for change. And as outsiders, one can raise issues that those within a culture may not see or be able to because of power dynamics or because they're charged issues. But it works best when you work with local change agents, and local change agents are empowered to find the right entry points to ensure relevance, the right rhythm, in addressing those inequities. The second principle is leaders change to lead change. And we all know that commitment, inclusive leadership by senior leaders is absolutely fundamental to ensuring that DEI is sustained. But when leaders embrace DEI with real authentic purpose and passion, the organization goes from what I call performative action to sustainable progress. And to do that, leaders have to internalize the benefit of DEI to themselves and to the organization. And very often that requires a disruption of their worldview. Mm-hmm. And that sometimes happens, with the sort of often painful work of introspection. But, so transformative leaders, I think, are critical, and they combine inclusive mindsets and behaviors with concrete actions. And to me, personal behavior sort of demonstrates a conviction, but it's the action that signals the commitment. It requires intentionality to lead DEI as they would any other, business imperative. And in the book, I have some strategies for influencing leaders. The third principle is, and it's good business too. And I know you had some, sort of questions around that one, which I'd be happy to discuss. Yeah, so, without without a compelling reason for change or change narrative, 70%, and this is, well documented, changes fail. So, but, DEI cannot be siloed, it cannot be bolted. It has to be congruent with the organization's purpose and how business is done, and the local trends. The fourth principle is go deep, wide, and inside out. And this is simply that organizations are comprised of interconnected systems that work in concert with each other. And DEI has to be infused into the processes, the policies, the structures. You have to take a systems approach. So this principle considers the importance of embedding DEI both wide through scaling governance, deep by seeding change agents and local allies throughout the organization, and inside out by integrating DEI both internally and externally in the systems. And then the last one is know what matters and count it. Metrics provide this sort of global framework. They provide a cohesive narrative. They spotlight problem areas. They provide possible solutions. And honestly, metrics are instruments of change, but they have to be aligned with the local context. And you have to have managers, that are held accountable. So let me stop there. So those are the 5 principles. Yeah. Make it local, leaders change, etc.
Yeah, great. And I failed the first rule of interviewing an author, which is to hold up the book. So let me just hold it up, and I hope Jennifer won't kill me for this. But if you want the book, we're still going to send them out. So if you miss the opportunity to get the book, when you registered, then please feel free to ask us, and we'll get you a copy of this book. I can't get it signed, unfortunately, because Rohini's she's bouncing all over the world, so she's not available ever to sign the book. But at some point, maybe we can do that.
We'll get it.
Yeah, I want to dig into a couple of those principles a little bit more deeply. And one of the things is, and I think this is still true, over the years, I saw a lot of organizations started to move from country or regional kinds of organizational structures to more global structures. And what that meant in part was they were going to try to standardize business practices globally, right? And they were going to try to say, if we do it globally and we do it the same way, then we're going to increase our efficiency. It's challenging to do, but in a space like diversity and inclusion, obviously the tension between global and local is so palpable. Could you just, and your book obviously is called, Leading Global Diversity. And so can you talk about how do you strike a balance when you're trying to lead a global strategy like that with, the many different variations that diversity takes in each of the countries in which you operate, and you operated in over 100, I'm sure, right?
Yeah. So I think there are different ways of doing this work, right? So one is sort of a very local approach, and that's quite appealing because it's aligned locally. It gets embraced locally. There's buy-in, and the example that I use in the book is the example from Ahold Delhaize, right? So they have many different brands, very local brands, grocery chain stores. They hire in a 5-mile radius. The foods that they carry are tailored to the local population, which is wonderful. But one of the disadvantages is that it doesn't benefit from this cross-border sharing and infusion of outside ideas or best practices, and it can be inconsistent, right? It's fragmented, it's without any sort of broader accountability. The second approach is this sort of universal approach, which is top-down, it's standardized, and it's faster, it's cheaper, but there you don't get the local buy-in, if you will. So the example I use is a food delivery company that's headquartered in the United States, and they had this sort of a badge for Gay Pride Month that they wanted to have everybody around the world wear and really display very prominently. And their employees in Egypt were very concerned because it's not safe to be out in Egypt, and because of the laws there that penalize homosexuality. And so they were really concerned that there was no regard given to their safety in asking all employees to do it. So I think, it's faster, cheaper, as you said, it's, the standardized approach. The approach that I think really works well is what I call a transversal approach, which is that you have a global strategy, you have global metrics, you have a global framework, but local adaptation, local implementation. So that framework then gets sort of, customized locally, the targets get customized locally. You have these targets around recruiting, but how that's done is very, very specific to the local context. So that's how I would, describe the approach that I think organizations should take.
Great. Obviously, gender is something that, gender and disabilities are something that, will kind of play in any country in the world, although obviously the dynamics, if you go to, say, the Middle East around gender, are very different than they are in Western countries and so forth. And I love the fact that you said, don't just focus on race, because there is such a tendency in the US to see global diversity as being about black and white and that kind of thing. I wonder, even though you really challenge people to look beyond race, you made a really clear case that race is something that is kind of a loaded issue because it's perceived so differently in different places in the world. I love the way you kind of explored that topic. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about your thoughts about race and racism and why it's a topic we need to tackle, but it's also a complex one?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's a topic we must tackle. But I will say, and I'll own up to this, that I don't think that we did enough, or I did enough, to address race in a substantive way globally. It's honestly the most difficult dimension to address. It's extremely sensitive, it's politically charged, it's often talked about in code, or it's not talked about at all. And we did some work, particularly in Europe, where, if there are laws against gathering data based on ethnicity or race, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But with the refugee employment program, providing jobs and expanding empathy for refugees at work. And that was an entry point in the discussion on race, because refugees frequently belong to visible non-dominant groups. And in Europe, based on ethnicity, skin color, religion, etc. And, that was good work we did, but I still think, we didn't make enough progress. I think the moment is now to make that progress, because of the murder of George Floyd, other Black men and women going viral and creating this sort of movement around the world. We do have an opportunity. But what I realized was I was not alone. Most DEI professionals change agents feel very stymied about addressing, when they address race bias globally. And there are very few examples of best practices. The reason for that, Brad, is that, I really think that racism is both universal and it's very specific. And every context, as I said before, has its dominant and its non-dominant groups. And these differ. And race and racism are fluid. They're shaped to the culture and to the history of a place. So you really cannot use a cookie cutter approach to dismantling racism. You can't take sort of one perspective to the issue. And oftentimes it's tangled up with things like ethnicity, like religion, like caste, which take more prominence than race. So, in the US, we know that race is a driving social force. Elsewhere, it's one of several identities that divide, and that could play a less prominent role. So if we expect racism to be expressed in a manner that we're familiar with, we may miss some important entry points like discrimination against the lowest caste in India or religious minorities in India, or the ethnic undertones in Kenyan politics and in politics in other parts of the African continent. And to further complicate things, race is highly politically charged, highly emotive. In France, for instance, and I work for a French company, you're forbidden to gather data on race and ethnicity. Race was in fact removed. It was struck from the French Constitution in 2018, the word race. This was in response, you have to understand the context, to the persecution of the Jewish people and the efforts to rebuild France after World War II. And when France redefined itself, it redefined itself as indivisible, which means that they did not want to identify people by community affiliation, but rather by what they called objective criteria, like migration or citizenship. So you can't use identity, so that the state couldn't use identity data for state action. So the opening is now with what's the movement globally. It's opened up a space that was previously closed. So I'm just sharing the complexities. I think we have to not approach this topic with a limited one-dimensional, mindset, worldview. We have to be open to really perceiving the context and how it appears in that particular context, and then unpack it, understand it, and then work with local change agents to find entry points to disrupt the status quo.
Just to talk about the French example, like obviously they have a lot of North African immigrants who have moved into France. And so how would they be how would people like that be categorized if not by race, assuming French government wants to categorize people, or do they just say we don't want to do that?
No, they're just French.
They're French.
Unless there are others. Now, what's interesting is I found this one organization, and pardon my French, but it's called Club 21 Siècle. And what they do is they're working with McKinsey and a bunch of different organizations to try and gather this data. And what they're trying to do is, because the French basically say, you're Tunisian, you're Algerian, you're French, and that's it. They're not identified any other way. You can see visibly that they're Black people, but that's about it. But what they're trying to do is to actually gather data by doing a survey and asking people the nationality of their parents and their grandparents, so that they can then begin to tell whether, what their racial identity might be. But what is most interesting is that for the French, this was no big deal. Okay, you're asking me, and not only do they ask the nationality of parents and grandparents, but also the socioeconomic status. Mm-hmm. The Americans who were asked this question were appalled. This is confidential information. How can you ask this question about my parents and my grandparents? And socioeconomic information. So just, when I interviewed one of the women from this organization, she said, France and the US have two different dreams, is how she defined it. In the one case, we think it's absolutely appalling to ask about racial and ethnic identity, right? In the other case, you're telling us it's appalling to ask personal questions about nationality of my parents and grandparents and socioeconomic status. Yeah. So it's different ways of approaching it. I don't know that it's right or wrong, but how do you understand the context and then chip away to find those entry points to get to the outcomes you're looking for?
Right.
I don't have solutions, but I can say that, unless we're sensitive to these dynamics, we're not going to be able to make progress.
Yeah, and at face blush, you would think, well, France and the United States would have an awful lot of commonalities as countries, not such gross differences as you might see if you went to Africa or Asia or whatever it might be. And yet there's two well-intended approaches that really see the way to resolve these issues and to even understand these issues very differently, right?
Yep.
Yeah, interesting. What about countries, just another quick digression here, what about countries like Brazil or India, where I guess not everybody, but certainly the majority of people are of color? I guess I would use that expression. I don't know if that's the appropriate way. I mean, how does that work? Is there a racial component like in a Brazil or in terms of color of skin and that kind of thing, or in India that you have to be sensitive to, and how is that defined?
Yeah, and it would be great if Brad, if folks wanted to put their questions in the chat, because we could sort of answer those questions as well, just so we're meeting your needs too.
Yeah.
Because Brad and I can keep chatting forever.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So in terms of Brazil and India, so every place has colorism, right? I mean, it's how beauty is defined. There's a hierarchy of colorism regardless of where you are, what part of the world you're in. Whether it's kind of entwined with race and racism or ethnicity or caste, that's where it differs. So in India, yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's sort of a racial ethnic component to it, but certainly there is sort of a north-south component, a caste component, very much of caste component. So for instance, and this is a gross generalization, so please, this is more of a this is not a stereotype, but it's just generalizing to make a point. Generally the upper caste in some parts of India are lighter skinned. So, that's, again, it presents this hierarchy. So colorism exists. There's colorism based on what part of the country you're from, north or south. So, that also divides. So in Brazil, it's very interesting because in Brazil, the majority is Black. Over 50% are Preto or Pardo, which is Afro-Brazilian. Now, Brazil will declare itself as a racial democracy. And Brazil and many parts of Latin America had a very interesting and a very intentional policy called Blancamente, where they were intentionally whitening the population. So like in the US, if you have 1 drop of Black blood, you're sort of labeled as Black, you're categorized as Black. In Brazil, it was the opposite. So they were trying very hard to whiten the population. And they categorize people by color, and there are 140 shades of Black, brown, white. Wow. That they categorize people by. The intention is to basically show that this is, to show that, and they encourage intermarriage, which is the other thing. So it was discouraged in the US. In Brazil, it was encouraged because there was this intentional policy to try and whiten the population too. So colorism shows up in different ways. When you look at it, it's 50% of the population in Brazil, but they are the least employed, the poorest populations in the favelas, less than 5% in management leadership positions. So, clearly they're the majority, but the most disadvantaged populations.
Interesting.
Brad, we do have a question in the queue that's relevant to this discussion. Jennifer. So from Marissa, and she wants to know what advice you have for organizations to gather data and make those data-driven decisions when it's such a challenge in specific countries, like your example in France, where it's not even allowed, and there's cultural sensitivity to the question.
Right. So I think you've got to figure out what the laws, et cetera, are. Now, one company that's done this very well, and I don't know if there's someone from IBM on this call, but I think over 80% of their population is sort of covered by a self-identification question. So, I think clearly there are many parts of the world where you can ask these questions around, people with disabilities, LGBTQ. There are other parts of the world where you've got to adapt and figure out who the underrepresented group is if you want to really address that underrepresented population. So, in India, for instance, you might want to include some questions around ethnicity or around caste, although those are also very, very loaded questions. In Brazil, you would want to include questions around color, skin color. So I think there's ways of doing it. It's very time consuming, but what I like to say is, there's no ban on having the conversation. So data, yes, but you can have the conversation. So in France, you can still have the conversation with leaders to say, I see who your successors are. And you're talking about different nationalities because that's where they go as a nationality. So you say you have in France, you have, Norwegians, you have Belgian, and so you have many nationalities. But let's unpack this further and talk about the intent. And the intent is, how many of those are sort of minorities in their countries? In other words, how many of them are, Tunisian or Algerian or Moroccan, depending on what part of Europe you're talking about. So you can have those conversations. It's just, gathering that data is a challenge in Europe, but nothing stops you from having those conversations.
I just wanted to ask about one more of your focus areas in the book, and that's about leadership. And you talk about how leaders oftentimes have to break their own, perceptions, mental models about these kinds of issues. And you talk about strategies for the head and strategies for the heart. Can you just say a little bit about what you mean when you say you use both of those, kinds of strategies in order to help leaders get past their personal perspectives or biases?
Yeah, and so I do have a bunch of strategies. The head strategies are more sort of data and facts, and very often it's about the business case, right? It's about, and I don't like calling it a business case, it's a change narrative is what I call it. Now, I'm sick and tired of that. And, I often say, when is the last time we made a, business case for white men, right? Why do we have to do it for women? Having said that, there are parts of the world where it's still very critical. In fact, I'm working with one particular organization which is in Europe, and the CEO is leading with social justice. And he is not getting buy-in within the organization because you have sort of legacy employees, many of them white male, who are saying, what's in it for me? So whatever you've got to have, sometimes it's that data and facts that creates that change narrative. Oftentimes, Brad, I've worked with, organizations where I've brought in client organizations. When you hear something from a competitor or client doing something, you're likely to hear differently. Absolutely. When we talk about belonging, you talk about belonging to a culture, right? As a woman of color, having a belonging to the inclusive culture in an organization. But there's also this issue of belonging, which is belonging to this group of, diversity elite organizations, and everyone wants to be one of those. Yes. So creating that dynamic is important. So that's the head part. The heart part, I'm just going to narrate with a very quick story. So one of the stories is, the previous CEO of Sodexo, white French man, he said to me, why are you diluting the global focus on gender by bringing in issues like race and ethnicity? Because it doesn't resonate globally. And it doesn't. He's right. It does not resonate globally. But at the same time, I realized that, I needed to sort of expand his worldview on this topic. So invited him to the African American ERG in the US, in Texas. To his credit, he took 2 days and he came to that meeting. And he attended these breakout sessions where we had breakouts with Black men, Black women sharing their lived experiences. And it was very transformational for him. And the second piece that was transformational for him was the fact that he was, a minority. He was one of the only white men in that room, certainly one of the only French men in that room. Yeah. And that combination of what it feels like to be a minority, along with listening to the lived experiences of people who he knew, so it came close to home, it was very transformational. And from there on, he started asking these questions in succession planning meetings about, where are your people of color in the organization? What are you doing to advance them? But I will say the one thing I'll caution is that, stories can be transformational, but leaders have to use them with caution because it takes a toll on people to come out every single time and share those lived experiences. And leaders have to take responsibility for their own education, and use these sort of stories with caution and really maximize their impact. So.
Last question for me, Rohini, and then we'll go to the general questions, is when you look back on your career, you've mentioned some things you wish you had done better in terms of impacting race issues across countries and so forth. But what's the thing you're most proud of, or that you took the most joy in the work that you've done over your career?
Right. I think the most joy, and to me, I think that transformation really happens at the intersection of systems and people. So for me, it's sort of having changed the culture of an organization, really changed it. And we, took it from, and I talk about this in the book, from class action to best in class. So when I joined Sodexo, about 6 months after I joined, we had a lawsuit, and I didn't realize the seriousness of the lawsuit when I joined, but 6 months after I joined, it was certified as a class action lawsuit filed by African-American managers, a promotion discrimination lawsuit that predated me, and there were legacy employees. But so taking the organization from there to really an organization where the culture had changed, where people felt like their uniqueness was appreciated, they felt a sense of belonging, the fact that they could advance their careers. So that's one in terms of culture change. And the other piece is really, honestly, those people whose careers were advanced as a result of the change gave me great satisfaction when I heard people say, I just couldn't build, I would never have imagined that I would be this leader in this organization. And I feel, that I feel so, really good about where I am today. So that was the second. And people who's on the personal level, whose mindsets I had changed. The one CEO that I talk about, Dick Macedonia, he was very resistant, and he did not buy into what we were doing. And fast forward, when he retired from Sodexo, the only thing he chose to do was to be on diversity advisory boards. The only thing. He was on the Deloitte one, and you talked about Deloitte. He was the longest standing diversity advisory board member. He was the one who was sort of the most resistant when we started this work. I sort of talk about his journey there. So.
Yeah, excellent. I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer. If you have questions from the audience, Jennifer, maybe you could share those with Melanie, Rohini, excuse me.
Actually, I think we've touched on a lot of what was asked, and your last question was actually one that was in the queue. So I encourage people to put your questions in. We do have a little bit more time. Rohini, I did notice you're involved with a lot of boards and a lot of different projects, but one of the newer initiatives that you've been working on is something that relates to supporting the hiring of refugees. And with the world kind of in turmoil, would you just say a few words about that?
Yeah, sure. So, and then if you don't mind, Brad, one of the questions that, I have been asked very often, and I'll answer, if you don't mind my answering that, about sort of an example of how to make, things local and disrupt the status quo.
Yep.
So the organization I'm involved with is Tent Partnership for Refugees. It's a fantastic organization. And it's funded by the CEO of Chobani Yogurt, Chobani, Hamdi Gulukaya. You may have seen him on YouTube. He has a TED Talk, and he's just terrific. And what this organization does is to work with corporations like the ones that are represented here. There's no money to join, so I would really encourage you, if you're interested, if you can put my email in the chat, Jennifer, please.
Sure.
Anand1121@gmail.com. Reach out to me. I can connect you with Tent. And what they do is to encourage you to, either employ refugees and globally, and also to include, refugee products and services in your supply chain. So for instance, IKEA has this huge commitment, the IKEA Foundation, where they purchase a lot of goods made by refugee women from Jordan, from Syria, etc. So it's a great organization. And, with the talent challenge that we're having today, these refugees are highly qualified, and they're work-ready refugees. So it's not that you have to get them the paperwork. The paperwork is done. So they connect you with the organizations that have done the paperwork, and you can employ them. So it's a great way to address the talent shortage these days, because these are extremely well qualified, many of them well qualified refugees. And those in the food service and restaurant industry are really all over this as well, because it's a great sort of starting employment opportunity for many refugees. So, Brad, do you mind if I just share a quick story about, are there any questions on there? Would you want to listen to sort of this one example that I have about how, okay, I see Annie doing this, so I'm going to go for it.
She's the boss. She's the boss, Rohini.
There you go. So, yeah, the example, people have asked me, so, when you say you have to contextualize your efforts, does that mean you have to just accept the way things are? No, you have to understand it, you have to unpack it, and you have to work with local change agents. And the one example that I think is a great one is one of the, my colleagues at Sodexo, he was leading the business in Saudi Arabia, and he went to Saudi, and what he saw in terms of the situation of women didn't align with his own values and the values of the company. Now, to me, regardless of where you are, the values of the company really trump, right? So but he understood that he was a guest in Saudi Arabia. And, at that time, the Saudi government was beginning to kind of open up and allow people to work in multinational corporations, including women. So he hired women, but the women had to, because of cultural needs, they had to work in a separate room. You had to communicate with them through an intercom. If you had to go into the room, you had to take a male chaperone with you. So there were a lot of restrictions. And the women themselves started feeling that, in order for them to grow and to expand their careers, they would have to meet with men, in meetings outside that one room. So the Saudi men basically said, no, that's not possible, because they've got to be accompanied by a Saudi or a Muslim man if they're going to meet with another man. So this particular leader basically said, fine. He said, if you can accompany them to every meeting, please go ahead and do that if you have the time to do that. If not, you find a solution. So he partnered with these locals, and they basically came up with a solution, which was that they could meet, the women, Saudi women could meet. And remember that the literacy level is very, very high in Saudi Arabia, over 92%, very high literacy level for men and women. For women in particular, actually, it's a higher literacy level than for men. So he basically, what they agreed was that they could meet with the men so long as the office door was open and they were sitting at opposite ends of the table. Simple solution, but it really went a long ways. And this was sort of partnering with the local change agents, and it went a long ways in actually enabling them to grow their careers. Singapore is another example, which is not an LGBTQ friendly country, but Barclays Bank in Singapore, along with Google and other companies, sponsored something called the Pink Dot Festival. And in I believe it was 1917 or 1918, when the Singaporean government said that multinational corporations could not sponsor the Pink Dot Festival, they had gained enough momentum and traction, and they had sort of encouraged a lot of local companies. So the local companies, over 100 local companies, took that over, and it was sustained. So it was, they partnered with the local companies, brought them along. So it's this outside infusion of ideas, working with local change agents to disrupt the status quo, but doing it in a way that really, understands and respects the culture of a place. So I hope those examples help just to demonstrate that it can be done. It just has to be done with sensitivity.
Great, thank you. I think that kind of wraps up our session. Just again, the book is Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. It's an excellent read, especially if you're in the change business, and if you're in work life or flexibility or mental health or diversity and inclusion, you're in the change business for sure. And all of those things require, a great degree of how do we influence the organization, not just set policies, because policies can be ignored, but once you get leadership bought in and really committed to this stuff, that's where the rubber meets the road. So we are happy, I think, to send that book along to anybody else who's been on the call and enjoyed this conversation. One of the things, I get tired of the business case, Rohini, for some of the same reasons you mentioned. I think both what we don't make a business case, as you said, for white men. So why do we have to make it for everybody else? And also there's a certain point at which I came to realize that, the business case is interesting, but that's not what flips the switch with most senior managers. Most of them have some kind of a personal, aha moment. And that is much more likely to change their way of looking at the world than a lot of charts and graphs. I'm not diminishing the usefulness of those. It's just I was never convinced that's what really convinced people to make the right moves here. One last point I'd just say is, like, if people, I guess within each country you can have reasons for resisting diversity, and each country presents its own challenges. But if you're in a global business, you're in the diversity business, and so the business case is made for you. If you don't know how to work across cultures, across countries, across languages, across legal environments, then you're just not going to be successful in a global business. It's inherent in global businesses that you must be good at this, and you must understand how other cultures and other countries operate and think. And so I don't know if that resonates with you, Rohini, but when you're working in a global organization like Sodexo, if you don't think globally, and if you can't get your head around the fact that you're working across very diverse populations with diverse environments and circumstances, then you're probably never going to be very successful as a global company to begin with.
Yeah, no, I would entirely agree with you. I think that, that is, there's a necessity to understand and work across cultures and countries. But I do think that we have to also recognize that, organizations are at different levels of maturity.
Sure.
And they need different things. And also in different parts of the world, there's different needs in terms of bringing people along. This example that I shared of, this one organization that I'm working with, where the CEO led with social justice, but there's this whole group of, legacy white men in the organization for whom it just doesn't resonate. And remember, in this polarized, world that we live in, that is, bound to happen. It's likely to happen. So how do you bring them along is, you give them some kind of a, what's in it for me. And, I get tired with the fact that we have to bring these people along. But the reality is, without that, we're going to get stuck with any change effort. So yeah, you're right. I think there is an inherent business case for doing global work, because you have to, interact with so many cultures. But I think, beyond that, one has to just look at, how do you embed the reason for doing this within a business model, whatever that is.
Absolutely. Well, Rohini, it was a fantastic conversation, and I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us.